sharing my screen. And I will try to talk about MPAs in relation to the Baltic Sea harbour porpoise, which is my sort of area of expertise. This is what I do every day in some way or another. So I'm going to start just briefly with harbour porpoise biology, just to introduce the species. So the harbour porpoise is the only cetacean present year-round in the Baltic. So this is our one and only whale. It's a small whale that lives in cold waters, which means it has to eat almost constantly. There are different studies showing that they catch prey many times per hour, maybe 100 times per hour. So they are really dependent on having access to food all the time. They can go approximately 3 days without food, then they die. So it's quite an acute issue for them. They eat in the Baltic, they eat cod, sprat, herring, mostly pelagic species, but also they eat what they have. Since they have to eat all the time, they eat what they have access to. So they probably eat now round goby and so on, because there's a lot of it. And importantly, for their survival, they use echolocation to find their way around, to find food and to communicate. And this is small clicks that they send out and then they listen to the echo coming back. And that's how they see in the marine environment, which is, as you know, quite dark at depths. There are 3 populations of harbour porpoises in the Baltic region. So we have the North Sea population, which comes in from the North Sea and lives also in Skagerrak. Then we have the Belt Sea population, which lives in the Belt Sea and the Kattegat, and a bit of the Western Baltic Sea. And then we have the Baltic proper population. And the Baltic proper population is listed as critically endangered by the IUCN. There's only a few hundred animals left today. And obviously this is our focus at CCB, to try and save this population and make sure that we get to keep this little whale in the Baltic. We know that this population is both genetically and morphologically different from the neighboring population. And that means that if the Baltic proper population disappears, we don't know that it will be replaced by other porpoises. So that's why it's even more important to keep them around. So to designate, Hanna just mentioned that it might not be the best way to go about it, to designate MPAs or to do marine management based on species. But sometimes, like in the case of the harbour porpoise, I think it's necessary, because when you have endangered species, you need to take extra measures. But to be able to point out MPAs for a species, you need to know where this species is. And this was one of the aims of the Samba project, which ran 2010 to 2015. So this was a European funded project about specifically the Baltic proper harbour porpoise population, because previously we didn't really know where porpoises were in the Baltic. So what we did in Samba is that we placed 300 harbour porpoise click detectors in the Baltic Sea. So these are devices that sit in the water column recording harbour porpoise clicks. And each of the, I hope you can see the little dots. They're empty dots, there are crosses, and there are filled dots on this map. And all of those symbols are one click detector that was placed in the Baltic for 2 years. So from 2011 to 2013, these click detectors were in the water, gathering information on presence of porpoise. And this map that you see, you can see the black dots represent where the porpoises are in summer. So from October, from May to October. From that data, we calculated a distribution map. So this map shows the probability of detection. So basically the presence, where are the porpoises present in the Baltic? You can see this border, the dotted line between sort of the southwestern Baltic and the Baltic proper. And that line shows where we, from this data, think that the Baltic proper population is separated from the Western Baltic and Belt Sea population. So can you see my cursor? Can you see where? Yes, good. So you see this area in the Baltic proper, south of Gotland, around these offshore banks that we have in this area. This is the most important for the harbour porpoise population in the Baltic Sea. And this is where they are in summer. And summer is when they give birth to their calves, and also they mate so that the females are then pregnant for the next year. So this area is one of the most important areas for the Baltic proper harbour porpoise. Based on this map, countries were obviously looking to see what they had to do for the Baltic proper harbour porpoise. And Sweden, the county administrative board, so basically the smaller regional organizations in Sweden, authorities, proposed areas for MPAs based on these harbour porpoise maps. And this is on the map here. You can see the areas that were proposed in Sweden. I use Sweden as an example, both because Sweden was one of the countries that did the most when it comes to MPAs based on the samba results, and also because 98% of the population is in Swedish waters during summer. So Sweden has a big responsibility for this population. So this is the areas that were proposed for protection. And the striped blue areas here are the areas that were finally designated for porpoises. So these are now MPAs where porpoises are listed. They're Natura 2000 areas. And we can see some differences between the sites that were proposed and the sites that were finally designated. For example, this part here on the southern mid-sea bank in the Baltic was excluded because the Swedish government wanted to have offshore wind farms in this area. And obviously, as NGOs, we don't really think this is an acceptable way of doing it. If this is an important area for porpoises, it should be designated as an Natura 2000 area. Anyhow, and the same thing goes for this area in Hanöbukten, the Hanö Bay, where we have both wind farm interests and also a lot of military activities. So that was completely excluded. But we have still this big area, which is the biggest marine protected area in the Baltic at this point. It's about 10,000 hectares, and also this area. But if you remember the population border that goes sort of from this area in Sweden down to Poland, this area is the one that's most important for the Baltic proper population. So how about managing those areas then? The threats to the Baltic porpoise is bycatch and static net fisheries, and that's the case for almost all small cetacean populations, but it's especially acute when a population is as small as this one. Porpoises are also disturbed by underwater noise, both from shipping and impulsive noise sources like piling for wind farms or so on. Harbour porpoise reproductivity, especially female reproduction, is hampered by high levels of environmental contaminants like PCBs. And we know that PCB levels in the Baltic are very high compared to other sea areas in Europe. And that means, and it's difficult. These are old contaminants that are already in the environment, so it's hard to do anything about, which means if our population here has a lowered reproduction rate, we have to make sure that all the other threats are minimized, because they're going to have an issue reproducing anyway. So this is quite relevant to keep in mind. They're also sensitive, as I mentioned, to prey depletion, because they are so dependent on having food around. So prey depletion and ecosystem changes can affect them quite a lot, even though we don't know at this point exactly how. So then, based on that, suitable conservation measures for a harbour porpoise MPA could be closures of static net fisheries to avoid bycatch. It could be ghost net cleanups to avoid bycatch in ghost nets, old nets sitting around in the environment. Limiting impulsive noise sources, rerouting shipping lanes so that the shipping lanes don't influence the acoustic environment for the porpoises too much. And obviously closures of all fisheries, as Hanna mentioned, having no take zones does improve the fish biodiversity and availability of prey for porpoises. So that's some of the measures that we could envision would be good for a harbour porpoise MPA. However, at this point, these areas were designated in 2016, and there are still no management plans in place. We can see on these maps here, this is the appointed MPA in Sweden, and these are the shipping lanes in black. You see that 2 shipping lanes go straight through this area with quite heavy traffic. This is fisheries, so this is static net fisheries, and you can see that there are there's not a lot of fisheries in this area, but there's still some static net fisheries going on in the area, and this is still ongoing. So to a large extent, this area is still just lines on a map. So what's ongoing now? In 2019, a coalition of NGOs submitted to the European Commission a proposal for emergency measures, and also a formal complaint about bycatch of cetaceans in the entire EU. This resulted in 2020 in the European Commission asking ICES for scientific advice on mitigating bycatch for the Baltic proper harbour porpoise, and that came out in May 2020. So that's a very good step on the way to proving to managers that this is what we need to do. And there was also an infringement procedure started against Sweden for not properly complying with the Habitats Directive in relation to harbour porpoise. So there's a legal process ongoing against Sweden. This year, based on the ICES advice, Baltfish, the Baltic Regional Fisheries Organization, have submitted a joint recommendation to the Commission, and this will very likely be transposed into a delegated act to go to the European Parliament this fall. And this contains closures of fisheries in some of the MPAs. The big Swedish MPA will have be closed for static net fisheries all year round, and a smaller part of that area will be closed to all fisheries all year round. So that's a good step on the way. We hope that it will not meet any resistance in the Parliament, that it will come through quite quickly. However, hopefully in 2022, this delegated act will be in place and these measures will be in effect. So that's a good step on the way to protecting porpoise in these areas. Then the question is something still missing? There are a few questions that I thought we could discuss. It's 12 o'clock now, so I've tried to be a little brief. The first question is, are we missing conservation measures within existing sites? And I would say that yes, we are, because as Hanna mentioned before, very few MPAs are actually managed, and this goes as well for all of the harbour porpoise MPAs in the Baltic, not only in Sweden, but basically all countries are missing conservation measures in harbour porpoise MPAs. Are we missing protection of relevant areas? Well, you saw the maps that I showed previously that some of the proposed harbour porpoise areas were not designated. So we are missing important porpoise sites that are not protected today. And the next question, if a species is down to a few hundred animals, is it enough to protect it within MPAs? Maybe we need to have protection outside of MPAs as well. And this is something that we as NGOs are currently struggling with, because the ICES advice that came out last year also advised that static net fisheries should use pingers. This is a pinger. It's put on nets and it makes small sounds so that the harbour porpoise can see the net with their acoustic abilities. Instead of getting caught, and they can avoid it. And pingers are proven to decrease bycatch by about 80% at least. So deploying pingers on static nets in the entire Baltic would mean that we could decrease the risk of bycatch quite a lot for this threatened population. However, countries have been very hesitant to implement this measure. And now we have also an issue of national security, because quite a few of the military forces in the Baltic Sea countries have said that we cannot have pingers because it would make it more difficult for navies to detect mines and submarines and so on. So that's where we are now. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like there will be pingers, or we're still trying to push the issue. And maybe we will hear from Peter after lunch, who will talk more about underwater noise and how this could affect the porpoise and the navies. I think that's it. Thank you for listening.